I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and if you've got 70 or 80 grand to spend on a premium hot hatch, should you buy the new entry-level AMG, the A35, BMW's first foray into non-rear wheel drive hot hatch motoring, or the now very much tried and tested Audi S3? That's what we're going to be finding out today. Later on, we'll look at the interiors of these three luxury hot hatches, but of course, these vehicles are all about how they drive, and that's where we're going to start with three tests. How easy are they to launch, and then their general pace, what's their cornering tenacity like, and then which one is best to live with in terms of everyday comfort. So strap yourselves in for the luxury hot hatch battle of 2020, and let's get to it. But first, how much do each of these luxury 5-doors cost, and what do you get for your money? Let's have a quick peek at specification. The thing about the Mercedes-AMG A35 is that it's the most expensive hatch here by some margin. Given it lists at over $69,000 here in Australia, it's more than $4,000 more than the next car here, the BMW. So it's got to justify its place that much more, especially when you consider that this vehicle is almost $95,000 drive away with its options. Is the 225 kilowatt, 400 Newton meter 2-litre turbo enough? We're going to find out. So the new BMW M135i, we know it is a 225 kilowatt, 450 Newton meter 2-litre turbo petrol under the bonnet, but what does it cost? Just under $65,000 here in Australia list, so you'll be paying about 70 grand on road, a little bit more with the options on this car. But the standard equipment is pretty generous, so you don't actually need to tick any more boxes. Given the Audi S3 Sportback is the oldest car here by a big margin, you'd expect to pay the least for it, and you do. For this 213 kilowatt, 380 Newton meter 2-litre turbo hatch, you pay just over $64,000 list here in Australia, just under 70 grand drive away, and there's very few options because for the end of this car's life, they've just given it all of the optional features essentially as standard. So in terms of a value buy, the Audi's where it's at. Next up, the interior game. These cars are just as much about impressing your family, friends and co-workers as they are about the driving. So let's jump in and find out which is the most opulent. In terms of wow factor inside, it has to be the Mercedes-AMG A35, doesn't it? The new MBUX based interior that's starting to flow through Mercedes-Benz products has awesome levels of technology, but also the interior design and quality is on a high note. Now, I tend to think Mercedes cabins go through waxing and waning periods of quality. Thankfully, the new A-Class is actually really good. The build quality feels great, everything is really well screwed together, and the design is modern, although it's so busy that it won't be for everybody. Case in point, the AMG steering wheel, which is nice to hold and a good thickness, but there's so many controls, there's so much going on. You have drive modes, you have damping and stability selections on the wheel. You of course have nice metal paddles, but then it's everything here which takes a lot of learning and getting used to. So you have one trackpad for this screen over here, another trackpad for the driver's screen, and almost endless customization. But at least that means you'll be able to get to a setting that you really like, and this is mine. With navigation on this screen, which is also a touchscreen, so you can control it further through this pad down here, so there's lots of choice. And I like to have my media and traditional gauges on the screen in front, though there's, as I said, a ton of customization. Now, these seats are lovely. They are a fairly pricey option though to get the AMG performance seats. Here they're in red and black, which is a color combination that I think works really well with the aluminium trim, perforated leather-like surfaces up here on the dash, and of course these really cool air vents. So in terms of visuals and in terms of quality, I actually think it does stack up. Plus you can get features like ventilated climate seats that you can't get in the other cars here. So up front, life's good. What about in the second row? It's actually the A-Class that has the most spacious back seat. Careful of the optical illusion though, because this seat sort of moves forward and out of the way when you get out of it, so there's a little more room than normal, but in the B-roll you'll see the genuine amount of space, because for me at 6 foot, my headroom is good, got another couple of inches. We have a fixed non-opening piece of glass here, which I've always thought was a pointless way of putting weight in the worst place, but anyway. We have leg room, which is decent. Toe room is a little bit constrained. Now, this is the only car with a flip-down armrest, which does have a pair of cup holders. Always nice if you're going to have a longer road trip. Those cool air vents are repeated, plus a little opening tray, 2 USB-C ports, and premium materials in the back, though they do get a little bit thin. The interior of the last 1 Series was nothing amazing, and the new one hasn't changed all that much in design, but that's not going to matter to people that love BMW cabins, because they're often plainer looking than their rivals, but have high levels of quality and lots of intuitive technology, and that's exactly what you get in the new 1 Series. And in fact, the quality takes another hike up, with this particular vehicle feeling incredibly well screwed together, with no noises emanating from any of the plastics, which is always nice. But the same can be said for the other 2 cars on test, and that's good when you're paying this kind of money. Now, the interior in the new 1 Series kind of based around these 2 screens, which are tilted a little bit up and out of the way. We've got a touchscreen here in the center. You do have control with the traditional BMW iDrive system. You get some cool stuff like satellite mapping as well if you zoom out. Then there's a second display in front of you, which is a little bit smaller, definitely underutilized compared to those in the Merc or in the Audi. I reckon BMW could have done better or kept their pretty analog gauges. What I love though about the 1 Series is that you can get these beautiful full Alcantara seats with a little bit of black cloth running down the center. They really grip you well. They are an alternative to leather, especially if you don't want animal skin products in the car. And then up here we got some blue stitching, and otherwise it's largely oppressively dark in this cabin, I would say. Lots of light let in from the opening sunroof though. It's the only car in this test which has one of those. The material quality is also very good. The driving position is great. So there's actually a lot to like about the new M135i's cabin when you start to peel back those layers. But what is life like in the back? Because you will remember, part of the justification for going to a front drive platform for the new version was more space in the second row. So has that worked? Well, for me, my headroom's good, even though we have that sunroof, which is always good to see. It's legroom, which is a bit of an interesting point. So I've got maybe ½ an inch behind these tombstone seats. Nice feeling Alcantara though back here. So perhaps it hasn't been as stretched as some people might have expected, but tow room is okay. In terms of amenities, we got air vents, 2 fast charging USB-C ports, nice soft touch materials, but no flip down armrest, a bit like the Audi. The thing is, even though the Audi S3 is the oldest car here, the interior has remained, for me at least, a benchmark in this segment. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best here, but I think it has held up incredibly well, both design-wise and quality-wise. Now, some of the technology is dating a bit. This central screen, although it looks very cool, is a little bit low res now, and you can notice that in the fonts. One of my favorite features about the S3 is you can actually just put that away entirely, and that's how I drive the car, with this really great view out, because you can actually do all the infotainment through this screen here in front of you. Now, this is one of the OG digital driver displays, the Audi Virtual Cockpit, and it's actually still the best in the industry. I really like it. Now, everything is standard in the S3 these days because it's at the end of its lifespan, so you have premium Bang & Olufsen audio, these lovely soft leather seats with diamond quilting stitching up here, but they are fully manual, which is a bit of a shock at this price and an annoyance if you're going to have a couple of drivers. The driving position is also a little bit high, but you get used to it. And you sit behind this lovely perforated steering wheel, the smallest of the group and the best to hold. Plus, the quality of everything else in here is absolutely top notch. In fact, the interior quality is still the best in this group. But what about life in the back? Let's check that out, because of course, like the others, the S3 has to be practical for 4 adults. So is it? Well, for me, my headroom is okay. I've got another inch or 2 as a 6-footer. Legroom, I'm pretty close to the back of this cool tombstone style seat here, but it's livable enough, and tow room's pretty good. In terms of amenities, we have netting on the back of those seats. We have air vents and a 12-volt socket, which is a bit old school, isn't it? No USB ports and no fold-down armrest, which is a little bit cheap. Thankfully though, the premium materials, they do continue here in the back. All right, what about boot space? Because each of these 3, as hot hatchbacks, they need to have a bit of space in the back for you to store whatever it is you need in terms of everyday clutter. So we'll start at the smallest here, the Audi S3. Its all-wheel drive system has always taken up quite a bit of space underneath the boot floor. Same with the Volkswagen Golf R, that's mechanically very similar. So there's 340 litres in the Audi, but you do have this nice net. You've got a netted section off to the left, and you've got a couple of hooks as well. Now, what about the BMW M135i? Because remember, when they changed over from rear drive, they were like, it's all about practicality, it's about space in the boot. Well, you get a whole 20 litres more than you used to taking it to 380 litres now, so not exactly what I would call night and day, but you do get some underfloor storage, actually quite a lot. You get 2 hooks as well, and of course, as we just saw, the electric tailgate, which is all a bit lush, isn't it? But what about the Mercedes-AMG A35? Well, more or less splits the difference. Back to a manual tailgate, 370 litres of space. This one has the most pronounced step in, so you'd be sort of pulling suitcases up and out, but you do have 2 netted areas and 2 hooks, so it does have the most clever special features, and of course the craziest wing ever, but you have to pay extra for that.
But now what it's really all about, the driving. You'll remember our categories are launches and pace, cornering tenacity, and everyday comfort and livability. Before we launch into that though, let's hear what each of these vehicles sounds like before heading in to drive the A35 first.
So the A35 gets off the line fairly cleanly, second best on test in terms of launchability. As we'll see when we jump into the Audi, that vehicle still delivers the best kind of quattro-driven jump off the line. Not that these all-wheel drive systems are actually all that different. They're both Haldex style, sending up to 50% of torque to the rear axle. The A35's biggest issue comes from its gearbox, but we'll get to that in a second, because first of all, there's no denying that this is a quick car with a good engine, running 4.7 second 0 to 100 sprints with a genuinely capable 2-litre turbo, putting out 225 kilowatts of power. The thing is, it's actually the engine from the A250, but with power and torque dialed up by way of a bigger turbocharger and other modifications. Not that that's a problem, of course, because we already liked that engine a lot in the warm rather than hot version in the A250 that's cheaper to buy but not quite as fast. Both deliver really good throttle response, including the A35 with its bigger turbocharger, which is even more impressive. And they also have a good engine note, but especially this AMG version. So I'd say it is worth the extra money over an A250. That said, genuine hardcore hot hatch enthusiasts will want to wait for the A45. What about cornering tenacity? Well, the A35 is the best of the group in that regard because it has excellent steering and the best tyres, plus a chassis that is really well tuned for the job. So you can turn it in and the car just flows through the bends, largely uninterrupted by any kind of struggle. That is, unless you cop a really big mid-corner bump. And that's because, while the damping in this vehicle is really good, there's a decent enough amount of suspension travel. The 19-inch wheels and their thin sidewalls of those tyres just mean that you're not left with very far to go if you encounter a big bump in a corner. And honestly, I'd prefer this car on smaller wheels. I don't really think a hot hatch needs 19s, but every car in this test has them, so perhaps I'm wrong. The overall ride is decent. It is quite firm though. The Audi is more relaxed. The BMW is a little bit firmer again, meaning the AMG ends up in about the middle. But the steering rack also feels really good. It's quite quick and direct for this group. You do feel dialed in. It's a nice little driver's car. And that brings me on to everyday livability. And that's where the A35 is pretty impressive, unless you live down the end of a really bumpy road, because that damping is comfortable enough to live with every day. You could certainly daily this. The comfortable seats are enjoyable, the view out is good, there's a nice crisp sound system, and you have plenty of adaptive safety features to keep you safe as well, though not all are tuned as well as I might like. So that ride, it's okay. You do need to test drive the car to work out whether it might be slightly too stiff for you, but I thought it was acceptable. The Audi is the most comfortable of the bunch, however. Now about those adaptive safety systems, the lane keep assist is very good, the optional 360-degree camera is very good, but the tuning of the forward collision warning is very sensitive, even on its least sensitive setting. The car, if it thinks you're on a line to intercept vehicles parked on the side of the road. It'll be grabbing seat belts at you and beeping, even if the natural trajectory of the road is to turn. So I found it to be a little bit probably oversensitive and in need of some finer recalibration in future. So how does the BMW M135i rate in our three categories of how these vehicles drive? Well, let me tell you, this new BMW hot hatch is really a mixed bag. But in this first subset of things, how easy is it to launch, and then its general paciness, it's not great actually. The launch procedure is a little unusual. It does have a dedicated launch mode, but it doesn't feel like it's as locked down as the other two. Like, it just keeps creeping forward even when you're sort of heavy on the brake. So it doesn't feel, you know, as adapted as a launch mode. But at the end of the day, these sort of launch modes don't make all that much difference. And often the fastest way to launch a car is doing it the old way. And once you take that into account, the M135i pulls out one of its big trump cards in this set, and that's its engine gearbox combination, which is the best here. So what we have under the bonnet is not a 3-litre inline-six, unlike the old BMW 1 Series flagship, the M140i, and a lot of people, including me, are sad about that. But thankfully, the 4-cylinder it's been replaced with is one of the world's best of this type. It's the BMW B48 engine, 2 litres in capacity, turbocharged, producing pretty prodigious outputs. 225 kilowatts of power and 450 newton meters of torque. So it equals the A35 on power, and it has the most torque of this group by a significant 50 newton meter margin. And as such, it does feel really strong, especially once you're at pace. But even off the line, it gets on best here because it's the only car with a traditional torque converter automatic gearbox. Interestingly, it's not a ZF box. It's made by Aisin, but it's not sort of wittingly much worse than the ZF version that we're used to in most modern BMWs. It's still better than both dual clutches on test here. Throttle response can initially be a little doughy, especially in comfort mode, but once you chuck the car into one of the sport modes or your own individual setting, it becomes a bit more alive, and it's also accompanied by a really decent sound from the exhaust that's clearly audible in the cabin. So the engine's good, the gearbox is good. That brings me on to the 1 Series' cornering tenacity, and this is where a BMW is really supposed to shine, right? The ultimate driving machine and all that. But actually, a couple of silly choices in the specification of the M135i hold it back from being as good as I know that it could be. And that comes down to tires, and it comes down to wheel size and suspension. So now this is an M Performance BMW, so it's always going to be stiff and firm, and we want that. But we also want compliance with Australian roads, which are famed for being pretty pockmarked a lot of the time. And I talk about that on our videos very often, so you're probably well versed in it. The M135i in Australia comes on 19-inch wheels with fixed dampers, fixed M Sport dampers. That's an important fact to remember. Now, that really stiff suspension setup initially makes the 1 Series good for cornering because it means the body sits really flat, you're not sort of wallowing around whatsoever, and this is actually the lightest car on test as well, so that all helps. The problem is that the stiff suspension, which doesn't give the body any lean, requires a grippy tyre, because if the chassis can't help by leaning a little bit in the corners, then you need a really, really good tyre if you're dealing with a 1.5 tonne car, which we are. Now, that has not been specified because the tyres on the M135i, bizarrely, are Continental Conti Premium Contact, which is not a performance tyre. I mean, I have them on my 90 kilowatt Mark 6 Golf, which is a shopping trolley kind of car. And so as such, when you get loaded up in the corners in the M135i, the chassis can't help you, the tyres can't help you, so what you get is push understeer. And compared to the supremely dialed in and sharp A35 and the sort of nicely flowing S3, which has pretty good tyres and a really good chassis, it just doesn't leave you with many options as a driver. Now, you can, of course, take those tyres off and fit something a little bit more serious, but I mean, we've got to review the car that we're presented with, right? Not some hypothetical, especially when the other two are on better tyres, Michelin's in the case of the AMG and P0s in the case of the Audi. And that brings me on to everyday livability and the suspension in this car. As I mentioned, it's firm, it's the fixed M Sport setup, it's got big wheels, skinny sidewalls, so yeah, you probably heard the thump into the cabin just then. Thing is, the damping's actually pretty good. You don't really feel crashy bumps coming through into the interior. It isn't bad. The issue is when you hit a mid-corner bump totally loaded up, as I mentioned before, there can be some problems. Now, the alternative is to option 18-inch wheels for no cost and adaptive dampers for a cost. And it'd be interesting to drive a car spec like that, but there are none available in Australia right now. So the Audi S3 launches the best out of any car here. That's despite the fact it actually has the least power and torque out of this group. The difference is it has the best launch control system. It holds the car at the right revs, and then the DSG gearbox manages to fire off the line well if you use launch control and then shifts up through the gears faster than the other two, both the AMG with its, well, not as good dual clutch, and the BMW with its torque converter system. So in that way, the Audi S3 punches above its weight. So what engine does it have? Well, a very familiar one if you're interested in Volkswagen Group cars. And that's because it is the venerable EA888 motor, a 2-litre turbocharged unit used throughout a whole bunch of vehicles made by Volkswagen, Audi and Skoda, including the Golf R, which shares many of its mechanicals with the S3. Now it produces 213 kilowatts of power and 380 newton meters of torque. The European version went down a little bit in power, and that's because it had to switch to a petrol particulate filter, but we don't have that on the Australian spec car. Now that torque is a bit down on the other cars here, but you don't really feel that because the Audi makes the best use of its engine. I do like the BMW's engine just that little bit more, but this one has been so long lasting and durable and continues to get the job done very, very effectively. And I think that the story is told in the fact that the S3 0 to 100 sprint is basically the same as the other cars here, despite weighing the most. That engine is sent to the same sort of all-wheel drive system as the other cars, sending up to 50% of torque to the rear axle via a 7-speed dual clutch gearbox, which actually is pretty responsive, and unlike the AMG, doesn't make the sort of sound of a slipping clutch at length when you take off with the lights. It hooks up better. It's just a better gearbox, and I think that shows Volkswagen and Audi's expertise in building these sorts of wet clutch DSG or dual clutch transmissions a little bit longer than Mercedes-Benz. Audi call it the S-tronic, but it's exactly the same gearbox as you'll find in the Golf R. Throttle response ranges between doughy in comfort and nice and kind of snappy in sport, and you can mix and match your drive modes as well, which is good. But the biggest sensation is that the S3 is just fast point to point. All of its inputs are so cohesive and harmonious, and you just find yourself devouring both mountain roads and even your commute because of how satisfying this thing is to drive quickly. So the S3 is good in a straight line. It's also good in the corners, and like the A35, has a real tenacity for the sort of bends that Australian roads throw up. Its steering rack isn't as good as that in the AMG, but it isn't that far off. It's just lacking a little bit of feel and feedback compared to the Mercedes, but these are both electric power steering racks, so there's not really any genuine feel coming through anyway. What I like though is that the Audi delivers its steering through this tiny little wheel, so your inputs feel like they're being multiplied. They also feel nicely connected to those front wheels, which are shod in Pirelli P0 rubber, giving you a high degree of grip in wet and dry conditions. Most hilariously though is the S3's tendency to engage easily in four-wheel drifts when coming out of slightly moist bends, of course on country roads where you have the space. Basically, the all-wheel drive system is a little bit more responsive and preemptive, sending more drive to the rear wheels than the other cars more quickly, I think. And what you end up getting is, even in the normal stability control mode, all four wheels having a little bit of a spin on the way out, which is a hilarious feeling and makes you feel flattered as a driver, basically. It's never unpredictable or unsafe. It's really nice. So cornering tenacity, it checks off that mark as well. What about everyday usability? Well, the S3 is actually the best car here in terms of everyday usability. and that's because it simply rides beautifully over Australian tarmac. The 19-inch wheels do send the occasional shudder into the cabin like the other vehicles here, but overall the damping is the best. It is the softest, but because it's the softest, it means it's a little bit less dialed in than the AMG, which may be your priority in a hot hatch like this.
So that brings us to the pointy end of our luxury hot hatch triple test. Each car here has its virtues and its vices, but what does the final ranking order look like? And first, some real standouts among the more niche features on this test.
Best wheel design. Best steering wheel. Best seats. Best boot. Best infotainment. Most roomy back seat. Best interior quality. But ultimately, with any comparison, there can only be one winner. And for us, it's the new Mercedes-AMG A35. Now, it isn't perfect. We don't like that gearbox take-up. It's also considerably more expensive as tested than the other two cars here. But that said, the cohesiveness of the package, the considerable dynamic abilities that it has, the punchiness of the engine, and of course that opulent but high quality interior help it to take the win. Second place for us is the Audi S3 Sportback. It's the oldest of this pack by far, but in a testament to how well it was engineered at the start, the S3 has aged really gracefully, both in the looks department, in my opinion, and in terms of how well it drives as a fact. Plus, there is the case that the interior of the Audi is still a really high benchmark for this segment in terms of build quality. Third place for us is the BMW M135i. To be honest, we're just not that convinced by BMW's transition away from its traditional rear-driven hot hatches, especially given that it has to step into the huge shoes of the old M140i. Don't get us wrong, this isn't a bad small performance car. It's devastatingly fast point to point. Its interior is comfortable and high quality. We just feel it's missing that sort of X factor to make it stand out from this pack, and also to justify its over $70,000 on the road price. Now, let us know down below this video which hot hatch you think should have won this comparison, or if you'd buy something else entirely like an i30N or a Golf R and pocket the difference. And while you're down there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss any of our full-length, highly detailed Australian video car content. Thanks for watching Chasing Cars.